The icy winds of the desert night whispered through the cracks of the old ranch house. 17-year-old James had arrived at his grandfather Eli's ranch earlier that week, hoping for a break from the chaos of the city. Eli, a hardened Navajo elder with a face carved by time, didn't say much but had strict rules James was expected to follow. Never leave the house after dark. Don't answer if you hear voices outside. And for the love of the holy people, don't whistle at night. James had nodded at the time, dismissing the warnings as old folklore. But on his fifth night there, curiosity got the better of him. The ranch felt suffocating, and the allure of the vast open desert called to him. Eli had fallen asleep in his chair by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall. James slipped outside, the door creaking softly behind him. The cold was sharp against his skin, and the stars above were blinding in their brilliance. It started as a low, mournful whistle. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound came from the east, near the old corral where Eli kept the horses. He remembered the warnings, the stories Eli told about skinwalkers, witches who could take the form of animals or mimic human voices. But the whistle was so faint, so plaintive, it sounded like someone in pain. He stepped toward the corral, flashlight in hand. The horses were agitated, stomping and snorting in their pens. James. He spun around, heart hammering. The voice was unmistakable. It was his mother's. James, the voice called again, softer now, almost pleading. It came from the edge of the ranch, near the dry wash where Eli had warned him never to go. Mom? James called out, his voice trembling. Help me, the voice begged. Without thinking, James climbed over the fence and ran toward the wash. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing jagged rocks and twisted sagebrush. He stumbled, his breath visible in the frigid air. Mom? He called again. He froze when he saw her. She stood in the shadows, her back turned to him, her figure shrouded in the pale glow of the moon. Mom? What are you doing here? She didn't answer, only turned her head slightly, enough for him to see her profile. Her face was wrong. The features were there, his mother's eyes, her nose, her mouth, but they were distorted, stretched unnaturally, as if someone had tried to mold her face out of wet clay. James, she said again, her voice echoing strangely. Before he could scream, the figure dropped to all fours, its limbs elongating grotesquely. The sound of bones cracking filled the air as it morphed into something monstrous, a skeletal, wolf-like creature with hollow, glowing eyes. James stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight as the thing lunged at him. Its claws raked across his arm, tearing flesh. He screamed, scrambling to his feet and running back toward the house, blood soaking his shirt. The ranch came into view, and he saw Eli standing on the porch, rifle in hand. Get inside, Eli shouted. James bolted through the door as Eli fired a shot into the darkness. The creature let out an unearthly scream, its voice warping between human and animal. Stay inside, Eli barked, slamming the door shut and bolting it. He scattered ash across the threshold and began chanting in Navajo, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. But the thing didn't leave. It circled the house, its claws scraping against the walls, its voice calling out in a perfect imitation of James's mother. Then it changed, calling out in Eli's voice, then James's. Eli stood guard by the door, rifle aimed, but his face was pale. I told you not to go out there, he muttered, shaking his head. You brought it here. The hours dragged on, the creature's calls growing louder and more persistent. Then the scratching stopped. Silence. Eli glanced at James, his expression grave. Stay here. Don't move. He unbolted the door and stepped outside, rifle raised. James waited, his ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed. Then he heard it, a gunshot, followed by a wet, gurgling scream. Grandpa? James whispered. The door creaked open and Eli stepped inside, but something was wrong. His movements were stiff, his eyes glassy. He didn't speak. Grandpa? James asked again, his voice shaking. Eli turned to him, a twisted smile spreading across his face. His mouth opened, and the voice that came out wasn't his. James, it whispered. Before James could react, Eli lunged at him, his body contorting unnaturally as the skinwalker revealed its true form. The last thing James saw was its glowing eyes and the grotesque grin stretched across its face. By morning, the ranch was silent. The desert had reclaimed the land, and the only sign of what had happened was the shattered door and the blood-soaked sand outside. The townsfolk never found James or Eli. They only whispered about the ranch and the warnings that had been ignored. and on cold, quiet nights, some swore they could still hear a voice calling from the desert.